On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1944, a 17-year-old girl named Marguerite climbed onto the back of an Army flatbed truck in New Orleans, dressed in her best clothes, one of 50 local girls recruited by the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Italian Hall on Esplanade Avenue. The truck was headed for Jackson Barracks in the lower Ninth Ward. Her job, along with the other girls, was to be a dance partner, chaperoned, supervised, entirely respectable, for several hundred young men behind barbed wire who had not held a woman's hand in over a year. The man she would marry was in the kitchen that night, not the dance hall. He'd been unhappy with Army food and had talked his captors into letting the Italians cook for themselves, so while the other prisoners danced, Mario stood over a stove instead. He noticed her before she noticed him. It would be another year before he asked her mother, through a translator, whether he could buy Marguerite a ring. He was, at that moment, a prisoner of the United States Army. 9 months earlier, he had been a soldier of the Kingdom of Italy, sent to fight and die in the deserts of North Africa in defense of an alliance with Adolf Hitler, and a doctrine that told him, without qualification, that the country now feeding him and lending him its daughters for a Sunday dance was a decadent, mongrelized, dying civilization that could never withstand a real war. If a story like this belongs to your family, if you had a grandfather, a great-uncle, a nonno who never quite explained why there was an American wife, an American photograph, an American surname folded into an Italian family tree, leave it in the comments. These stories are disappearing with the generation that lived them. Here is what almost nobody remembers about World War II. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 50,000 Italian prisoners of war were shipped to the United States and held in camps across 18 states. And what happened to their minds while they were here is one of the strangest, least told chapters of the entire war, because unlike almost every other story of captivity in human history, this one did not end in bitterness. It ended, for the overwhelming majority of these men, in something closer to love. But to understand how strange that outcome really was, you have to understand what these men had been told before they ever set foot on American soil. Fascist Italy did not invent its picture of the United States independently. It borrowed it, refined it, and broadcast it in lockstep with its senior partner in Berlin. The message across a decade of state radio, state newspapers, and state-approved textbooks was consistent. America was a plutocracy, a nation ruled by financiers and department store capitalists, spiritually hollow, racially undefined, a mongrel country stitched together from the world's rejected peoples. It could manufacture refrigerators and motion pictures, the doctrine went, but it had neither the discipline nor the unity of blood and spirit that fascism had forged in Italy and in Germany. It was, above all, soft, a nation of individualists who would not sacrifice, would not organize, and would not fight. Mussolini's own regime had spent years insisting that the coming century belonged to collectivist, disciplined states, and that liberal democracies like the United States represented a system already in historical decline. Soldiers absorbed this the way soldiers absorb any doctrine repeated long enough by people they're trained to trust, not as an argument they'd tested, but as a fact as basic as the weight of their rifle. Then came North Africa. By May of 1943, the Italian and German position in Tunisia had collapsed entirely. 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in the span of days, among them tens of thousands of Italians who had crossed into the desert believing in a swift, decisive war, and instead found themselves standing in the sand with their hands raised, waiting to learn what an American prison camp would look like. They found out on the water first. The ships carrying them from North Africa ran through the Panama Canal to the west coast, or across the Atlantic into Norfolk and Boston and New York, and what the men saw from the decks matched nothing in the propaganda they'd been fed. No bombed harbors, no blacked-out cities, skylines standing whole, cranes working, warehouses full. Then came the trains, and on those trains, for the Italians just as it had been for the Germans a few months earlier, came the 4-day education in exactly how wrong they had been. Towns with lit storefronts, farms worked by machines instead of men and horses, rail yards stacked with more freight cars than some of these men had seen in their lives. One captured officer, decades later, could still describe with total clarity the moment his train crossed into the American heartland, and he understood, quietly and without anyone telling him, that his country had made a catastrophic miscalculation about who it was fighting. And then, 4 months after the surrender in Tunisia, something happened that no version of fascist doctrine had prepared these men for at all. Italy switched sides. On September 8, 1943, following the Armistice of Cassabile, the Kingdom of Italy formally left the Axis and joined the Allies. The men who had surrendered as enemies of the United States were now, on paper, citizens of a co-belligerent nation. And the American government, with the same procedural thoroughness it applied to everything, sat down and asked each of the 51,000 Italian prisoners already on its soil a single, direct question. Would they sign an oath to actively assist the American war effort? 90% said yes. The men who signed became members of what the Army called Italian Service Units, ISUs. They traded prison fatigues for American-style uniforms with a small cloth patch reading Italy on the shoulder. They moved to work camps attached to Army depots, arsenals, shipyards, and farms from Massachusetts to California, laboring 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, to keep a war machine running that badly needed the 11 million American hands that had gone overseas. And in exchange, they were paid not much, but something housed decently, fed well, and in city after city with an Italian-American population, welcomed by their own diaspora with an intimacy that went far beyond anything the Geneva Convention required. In Boston, Roman Catholic parishes ran Sunday dinners for the men stationed at Fort Andrews on Peddocks Island, and local Italian-American girls turned camp socials into de facto dances. In New Orleans, the daughters of Sicilian-American families rode Army trucks to Jackson Barracks so often that people joked openly about girls going, husband shopping, at the prisoner of war camp. In San Francisco, Italian POWs on Angel Island were given enough freedom to rent a hall in the city with their own money and hold dances there. In California more broadly, families with official permission could simply take a prisoner out for the afternoon, a picnic, a mass, a plate of food that tasted like the food they'd grown up on, 3,000 miles from home. Now sit with that for a second, because it is the detail that made the psychological collapse of the propaganda so total. These men had been told America was a country without unity, without shared blood, without any deep culture worth belonging to. And the first thing many of them experienced as prisoners was being folded, almost immediately, into the warmest, most specific expression of that culture they could imagine. Their own culture, transplanted, thriving, and eager to feed them. A Louisiana lieutenant named Ermanno, captured in Tunisia while flying for the Italian Air Force, later had his courtship remembered by the woman who married him. She recalled spotting him on a bench at Jackson Barracks, reading a newspaper, a cigarette between his fingers, and knowing something in that instant before either of them had said a word. When repatriation came at the end of 1945, she stood in the crowd as trucks carried the departing prisoners to the train, watching him wave from the back until he was out of sight, and returned home to find a dozen roses waiting on her doorstep with a note promising he'd come back. He did. These are not isolated anecdotes tucked into a footnote. Historians who have combed through Italian POW letters and memoirs describe the genre almost as a recognizable form, capture, the long sea voyage, and then, again and again in different handwriting in different camps, the same stunned record of American abundance. Full rations, clean barracks, libraries, wages, courtesy, a guard who says please. But there is a second half to this story, And it matters just as much as the first, because not every Italian prisoner in America experienced anything like Marguerite's dance hall or Ermano's roses. Roughly 10% of the 51,000 refused to sign the collaboration oath. Some were career officers bound by a sense of honor to the flag they'd sworn under, whatever government now flew it. Others were true believers, committed fascists who considered cooperation with the Allies a betrayal no armistice could excuse. These men, labeled non-cooperators, were separated out from the general population and shipped to a single, isolated camp built specifically to hold them. Hereford, Texas, out on the flat, windswept plains of the Panhandle. At Hereford, there were no dances, no Sunday dinners with Italian-American families, no relaxed passes into town. There was barbed wire, armed guard towers, and roughly 4,000 men divided into hostile factions of their own, the officers who'd served since the beginning of the war calling themselves Mussolini's men, and a second faction of King's men, kept physically separated from them because the two groups could not be trusted in the same yard. For the first 2 years, by the prisoners' own accounts, conditions were merely Spartan. Then, in the final months of the war, American guards learned what had been happening inside the concentration camps of a defeated Germany, and in the anger of that discovery, the command at Hereford cut prisoner rations to levels that went well beyond punishment and into cruelty. A decision historians now describe plainly as a lapse the U.S. Army has no reason to be proud of. 5 Italian prisoners died at Hereford before the war's end. Put those two camps side by side, a POW compound in New Orleans built around Sunday dances and courtship, and a POW compound in Texas built around starvation rations and 2 rival factions of unrepentant fascists kept apart by armed guards, and you start to see what this story is actually about. It was never simply America is rich, therefore fascism was wrong. It was a test, administered by circumstance, of what a man does when the ideology he was issued like a uniform turns out to conflict with the plain evidence in front of his own eyes. 90% of these men, faced with that conflict, chose the evidence. 10% chose the uniform, and some of them paid for that choice in a Texas winter with an empty stomach. For the 90%, the reckoning didn't stop at admiration for American factories and American food. It went somewhere more personal and more permanent. Men who had been told their whole adult lives that Italy's future belonged to a doctrine of blood, discipline, and empire were now working alongside Americans, eating at American tables, courting American women whose own parents had once been the mongrel immigrants the doctrine claimed to despise, and finding, day after day, that the people on the other side of that doctrine's contempt were the ones showing them the most basic human decency they'd been shown in years. When repatriation began in the fall of 1945, tens of thousands of these men lined up to board ships back to a homeland that lay in ruins, an Italy of bombed rail lines, occupied cities, and a fascist regime whose leader had been executed and strung up in a Milan square months earlier. Many left behind women they had every intention of marrying. Because post-war immigration quotas made it nearly impossible for an Italian to simply return to America and marry an American sweetheart, the couples that survived the separation did it the hard way. The American women crossed the ocean to Italy to be married there, then came back across it as immigrants themselves, bringing husbands who had first seen the United States through the wire of a prison camp and now walked into it as citizens. That is the ending almost nobody tells you about this war. Not a Nuremberg courtroom, not a beachhead, not a bomber crew. A girl from the lower Ninth Ward standing at a dock in Naples, or Genoa, or Livorno, marrying a man she'd met at a chaperoned Sunday dance behind barbed wire, and bringing him home to the same city where he'd once been catalogued as an enemy of the state. What these 51,000 men wrote in their letters and their memoirs, when you actually sit with the words, was almost never really about tanks or factories or the number of trucks lined up in a rail yard. the way it was for the German prisoners who came through the same system. It was about something closer to home. They had been told America had no soul, no shared blood, no culture worth calling a nation. And the culture that proved them wrong was, again and again, their own, an Italian America they hadn't known existed, standing at a dock or a dance hall or a Sunday dinner table, waiting to remind them what they had actually been fighting to destroy. If this story moved you, a like helps more than you'd think. It's how these forgotten chapters find the families who are still, right now, wondering about a name in an old photograph. Subscribe if you want more of this history that never made it into the textbooks. And if there's an Italian, German, or Japanese prisoner of war story sitting somewhere in your own family's past, tell it in the comments below. Someone else's grandfather might be in that photo too.